Spring fell away into summer pretty fast here, but before it did, I got out with my puppy and had a really nice walk around the forest and did a little bit of moss harvesting in order to make a terrarium. So I thought I'd make a little video and show you some of the beautiful forests that are here in Nova Scotia, which is ironic because I'm editing this in very early June and I filmed this earlier in May, and there's been a lot of wildfires since, which I don't really want to get into because it was a little bit traumatizing. So these forests that are in this video are still perfectly fine, and I love them very much. This is where my parents live, and I drive out there sometimes and take my dog for a walk, and we just have the nicest times out here. All of these trails are maintained by volunteers, and I help the organization with other things. I help with their website and stuff like that, but I definitely love the beautiful landscaping they do and the trail maintenance. And the dog loves it too. He wants to come out here every single day, and I believe he does, but occasionally it's with me. And there are just so many birds that live in the forest, and occasionally bears also. So I was partly filming this to make a cute video, but also because I don't know if someone wondered where I went if I disappeared and got dragged off by a bear. Maybe they'd find my phone. I wanted to make a terrarium because this is something that I used to do, and actually I used to sell terrariums that I built because it's a very soothing hobby for me. I found it to be really important when I was recovering from an illness a few years ago and just needed to kind of spend time in nature and do some quiet, peaceful activities to start to feel better. And that's where I started to learn how to make terrariums, and I'm going to show you how I make one later in this video, and also sort of my philosophy around collecting the moss. I like moss terrariums because they are very durable and they can come back to life if you forget about them for a little while. The places where I go to collect moss are not public spaces. This is actually the property behind my parents' house, so I don't feel as bad going out there to scavenge for things. But there's the most beautiful moss ever just living in this old forest, and partly looking back at this footage makes me so sad about the wildfires that have been happening here that I had to evacuate for. But you know, there's still forest out there, and it still looks beautiful like this, even more so now that there's leaves on the trees. When I collect moss, I don't take very much. In fact, I never take from a full location, as you'll see here. It's a little hard to get up, but you never want to strip a full spot because you need to leave some moss and some spores so that it can grow back. And it doesn't grow very fast, so it's important to not do too much damage. As you can see, I'm just taking a little patch, and this forest is really full of it. Mindful harvesting practices are an important part of building the terrariums, in my opinion. And my dog likes to help a lot too. But being kind to the forest is really important in my view, especially when you're making something to take out of the forest. These terrariums I have at my apartment in the city, which I think is really nice just to have that little piece of home that I can look at and tend to, and a little piece of forest just, you know, in the big city. As you'll see, it's not a very big piece that I'm going to make, so you don't actually need very much material, and it does require a little bit of cleaning to make it tidy after you pick it all up off the forest floor. Moss is just fascinating to me. I find it's probably my favorite plant, and I have a lot of plants, so that's saying a lot. But every little shape can work in my terrarium, and I just put it in a little container to take back home with me. This is a good time of year to collect as well because the bugs aren't awake, although they are now. Let me show you what goes into making a moss terrarium. First, let's look at the materials that you're going to need. So I have my moss I collected here. Next, I have these big tweezer type things. They're actually used for feeding lizards, but I have used them for fixing candles, potting plants, any kind of little crafty tasks, so they're great. Next, you're going to need a container to build your terrarium in. Sometimes you can do a closed container. I'm doing an open-faced one here. It has one side of this cube is open, and that just means you have to water it pretty much daily. The closed environments you can kind of leave on their own. I'm also bringing in some water here. I have a watering can and a spray bottle, and that's just because the soil I'm using is super dehydrated in particular, but I use this spray bottle to water it daily after I make it. Then we're going to need some soil, and this is just potting mix I've had forever, and it is, like I said, very dry, so I'll rehydrate it, but any kind of potting mix would be great for this. I don't use soil from the forest because I don't know what's in it, and I don't want any bugs to wake up. In terms of tools, I just use a spoon and a paintbrush. The paintbrush is to clean any soil off the sides of the container, and the spoon will be to position the soil. I've also got some little decorative things I want to put in. So this is a tiny house that my brother made me. He makes miniatures, and it is sculpted and coated with a sealant, so it's waterproof, and it's on a little toothpick, so it can be lodged in nicely to my terrarium. And I also have some crystals here. Wasn't sure which ones I was going to use for my final display, but that's just an assortment of crystals that you can use. Make sure you don't use any that dissolve in water. Fluorites, I think. And a lot of the ites dissolve in water. And then this is my moss. Now it sat for a few days after collecting it between filming this video and the earlier footage. So I'm just going to rehydrate it by soaking it in some water. And this is also going to help me clean it. And by clean it, it's moss. You don't need to actually clean it, but I'm trying to get pine needles out of it because I don't like the way they look. But also as pine needles biodegrade, they make soil really acidic. And the moss may like that, but I think it's better just to kind of clean it out a little bit. You don't get all of the needles out, but that's just the forest that I'm collecting from as well. Is very pine needle heavy. This is a good chance to also check for little buggies or anything else floating in there that you may not want in your terrarium. This is sort of part of the peaceful part of making terrariums. It's very meditative. I don't do this in a hurry. When I used to make these to sell them, I had to be a lot more efficient, so I would do bigger batches of moss, which was more of a job because I was collecting, like I said before, just a little bit from different places. So I had a bit of a moss farm going on in my workshop for pieces for future terrariums. So once I've got enough pine needles out, I'm just cleaning off my tools, and then I'm going to start working on the actual tank itself. I have cleaned this out, and I'm just going to spoon in some soil. Like I said, it's very dry, so I will hydrate it after. You may see a lot of moss tutorials or terrarium tutorials where they add a layer of activated charcoal, and I think this is a good thing to do, but particularly for terrariums that are closed environments, because it's going to help limit the growth of bacteria and other things you may not want in your terrarium. I don't have any more. I used to have a big bottle of it, and I don't. But for an open terrarium like this, I don't worry as much because it's not as humid of an environment. And you'll see my little mouse vacuum there. This thing is the best thing I've ever bought. It's a desk vacuum, and it's very cute because it looks like a mouse. I love it. I use it for everything, including cleaning up soil, apparently. So I'm just going to use the paintbrush and clean off the sides a little bit, which can be a bit redundant when I'm going to pour some water in here and make a little bit of a mess in a moment. But it is a good tool to clean on the sides of your terrarium in general if you find that it's getting splattered with soil or mist and leaving water stains. Go for a paintbrush. So this rather inefficient method of rehydrating the soil is what I did, but this is not a step you have to do. I like to use filtered water for my terrariums, by the way, just so that there's not as much chlorine in them. I find it can affect the moss. So before we start putting things into the terrarium, I'm going to pull out some nice chunks of moss and just tidy them up a little bit and use my tweezers to pull out the pine needles that are sticking out. This is just a cosmetic kind of step, just sort of for the aesthetics of it all, but it does make a difference, I think, in terms of how pretty your terrarium can look. And when you really zoom in, you can see all the different textures within the moss, which is part of what I find so fascinating. Moss is also very easy to bring back to life if it's dried out. It is very resilient. So if you haven't watered your terrarium in a little while and then you do, you can kind of see the, I don't know, it's not leaves, the moss react to a spray of water, and it will dance as you water it, which is not a good reason to dry out your terrariums, but a fun thing to see when you bring them back to life. Once I get little bits out, I just position them into the soil with my tongs here. My strategy is always to position the moss first and then any other elements afterwards. I'll do moss and then sticks or twigs or driftwood or whatever else I'm going to put in. Then I add rocks afterwards. And I think that's because the moss is going to be the most unique shape, and you want to see where the gaps are that form naturally between your clumps of moss. These can fill out if your terrarium lives a long time and your moss starts to grow, but I do like to fill the gaps that the moss naturally creates with other little things, pebbles and rocks. Or cute little houses if you have someone kind in your life who will make you them, or you can make them yourself. I don't have a method for how to make the little house, unfortunately. I don't know his secrets, but I believe he makes them out of a lot of hot glue and then molds it and then paints it and sprays it. That's all I know. He can keep his miniature secrets. I'm just adding quartz into this terrarium. These are just some pieces of white or yellow quartz. They aren't anything particularly fancy, but I think they look really nice and the color composition works really well. Arranging stuff in a terrarium is a little bit of an art form, but it's also just a little bit of a chance to express yourself, kind of like flower arranging. There's not like a right way to do it, but there's definitely aesthetic principles you can apply. And when I think about how I arrange them, I kind of pretend it's a tiny village, almost like Hobbiton in the Shire. In fact, I have built Hobbit house terrariums before that were really cute. I loved those. Those were very beloved by me, and they went to good homes. But I like to think of it as a terrain just on a tiny scale. So adding different heights, different levels and textures, and then thinking about even like walkways through the moss. You can add little channels with sand or pebbles to make it look like a little gravel path. This is a very small terrarium that I'm building, so I don't have space for too much infrastructure, but I will add the little house in. And there it goes. I'm going to put it at the highest point, and it may need a little bit of adjusting, especially after everything settles in after a couple of days, but I think it looks so cute. And here's how the terrarium looks. It wasn't a very long project. It doesn't take long to make these. You just need a few particular materials and a little bit of patience for the composition. And the great thing is that you're not stuck once you build it. You can take everything out, try again, put things in different places, add in new elements, and it's just a really versatile, meditative little craft. The care and maintenance for it is not difficult at all. I just mist mine every morning when I look at and misting my other plants. But if you are going away or can't water it for a while, you can just put a piece of cling film or something else to seal the entrance and mist it before you go, and then open it up when you're home. So like I said, moss is very resilient, and it can withstand a bit of drought in between its waterings if need be. Here is the terrarium living with my other plants, very happily, mind you, and I'm just thrilled with how this looks. I haven't had a terrarium in my place since I moved, so I may need to clean the glass on this one a little bit, but very happy with how it turned out. I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial and video with me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again soon.